Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Chapter 20, Emmanuel de Grouchy, Marshal.
When the revolution broke out in 1789, the young Count Emmanuel de Grouchy was serving as lieutenant colonel in the Scotch Company of the Gardes du Corps. Born on October 23, 1766, the only son of the Marquis de Grouchy, the representative of an old Norman family which could trace its descent from before the days of William the Conqueror, Emmanuel de Grouchy had entered the army at the age of 14. After a year's service in the Marine Artillery, he had been transferred to a cavalry regiment of the line, and on his 20th birthday had been selected for the Garde du Corps. A keen student of military history and devoted to his profession, the young count had read widely and thought much. Impressionable and enthusiastic, a philosophical liberal by nature, he eagerly absorbed the teaching of the encyclopedists. As events developed, he found that his position in the Garde du Corps was antagonistic to his principles, and, at his own request, at the end of 1791, he was transferred to the 12th Regiment of Chasseurs as lieutenant colonel commanding. After a few months' service with this regiment, he was promoted brigadier general, and served successively under General Montesquieu with the Army of the Midi and under Kellerman with the Army of the Alps. At the commencement of 1793, while on leave in Normandy, he was hurriedly dispatched to the west to take part in the civil war in La Vendée. No longer Comte de Grouchy, but plain Citizen General Grouchy, for the next 3 years he saw almost continuous service in the Civil War, with the exception of a few months when, like all ci-devant nobles, he was dismissed the service by the decree of the incompetent Bouchotte. But Clanclos, who commanded the army of La Vendée, had found in him a most useful subordinate and a sound adviser, and accordingly, at his instance, the ci-devant noble was restored to his rank and sent back as chief of the staff to the Army of the West, and in April 1795 promoted general of division. Clear-headed, firmly convinced of the soundness of his opinions, without being bigoted or revengeful, Grouchy saw that the cruel methods of many of the generals did more to continue the war than the political tenets of the Vendéens and Chouans, and he used his influence with Clanclos and later with Hoche to restrain useless reprisals and crush the rebellion by overwhelming the armed forces of the rebels, not by insulting women and shooting prisoners. The problem to be solved was a difficult one, as he pointed out in a memoir written for Clanclos. It is the population of the entire country which is on your hands, a population which suddenly rushes together to fight, if it is strong enough to crush you, which hurls itself against your flanks and rear, and then as suddenly disappears when not strong enough to resist you. His solution of the difficulty was to wear down resistance by light mobile columns, and to starve the enemy out by devastating the country. In September 1795, on Clanclos' retirement, the commissioners attached to the Army of the West wished to invest Grouchy with the command, but the general refused the post. For, clear counselor and good adviser as he was, he lacked self-confidence and knew that he was not fit for the position. It was this horror of undertaking responsibility which dragged him down during all his career, and which, on the 2 occasions when fortune gave him his chance to rise, made him choose the safe but inglorious road of humdrum mediocrity. In 1796 came his first chance. After a brief period of service with the Army of the North in Holland, he was once again at his old work under Hoche in the West, when the Directory determined to try to retaliate for the English participation in the Chouan Revolt by raising a hornet's nest in Ireland. At the end of December, a force of 15,000 men under Hoche, with Grouchy as second in command, set sail for Ireland. Unfortunately, the expedition met with bad weather. The ship on which Hoche sailed got separated from the rest of the fleet, and when Grouchy arrived at the rendezvous in Bantry Bay, he found the greater part of the expedition, but no general-in-chief. In spite of this, he rightly determined to effect a landing, but had not the necessary force of character to ensure his orders being carried out. And after 6 days' procrastination, Admiral Bouvet, pleading heavy weather, refused to allow his ships to remain off the coast, and the expedition returned to France. If Grouchy had been able to get his orders obeyed, all would have been well, for on the very day after his squadron left Bantry Bay, Hoche himself arrived at the rendezvous. As Grouchy said, if he had only flung that Admiral Bouvet into the sea, all would have been right. Where Grouchy hesitated and failed, a Napoleon would have acted and conquered. Hoche died, and Grouchy, who under his influence had disapproved of the policy of France towards the Italian states, at once accepted employment in Italy. He soon had to rue his decision, for he found himself entrusted with the task of using underhand means to drive the King of Sardinia from his country. Still, he obeyed his orders to the letter. During negotiations, he secretly introduced French troops into the citadel at Turin and then seized the fortresses of Novara, Alessandria, and Chiasso. Meanwhile, he terrified the unfortunate monarch by announcing the arrival of imaginary columns of troops, suborned the king's council, and so worked on the feelings of the bewildered sovereign that he escaped by night from his palace and fled across the sea. But though their king had deserted them, the Piedmontese did not tamely submit, and for the next few months the general was busy tracking out and capturing the numerous members of the secret societies who were avenging their country by cutting the throats of Frenchmen. While striking with a heavy hand at these conspirators, Grouchy was level-headed enough to understand that the proper method of tackling the problem was to remove the grievance. In his opinion, it was not the people so much as the church which was opposed to the French. And accordingly, he did his best to get Joubert to issue a proclamation that there should be no interference with religion. Still, the situation must have been galling to a man of culture and a theoretical liberal, for, while forcing democratic institutions on an unwilling people, he had at the same time to strip their capital of all objects of art. And while issuing proclamations for the freedom of religion, he had to arrange for the passage of the Pope on his way to captivity. In May 1799, the general was recalled from his governorship of Turin, for the Austrians and Russians were invading Lombardy, and Joubert was concentrating his forces. The campaign, as far as Grouchy was concerned, was short, for while attempting to stem the flight of the left wing after the Battle of Novi, he was ridden over and captured by the Allies. 4 saber cuts, 1 bullet wound, and several bayonet thrusts kept him in hospital for some time. When he was well enough to be moved, he was sent to Gretz, and it was not till a year later, in June 1800, that his exchange was effected. But he soon had his revenge on the Austrians, for in the autumn he was dispatched to join the army under Murat, which was operating on the Danube, and arrived at headquarters in time to take part in the Battle of Hohenlinden. In the face of a blinding snowstorm, Grouchy's division drove back the main column of the enemy, and after hours of murderous hand-to-hand fighting in the forest, he shared with Ney the honor of the last charge which drove the enemy in hopeless rout. It was on his return from Hohenlinden that the ex-count met Bonaparte. The first consul, who aimed at conciliating the old nobility, made much of him, employed him on a confidential mission to Italy, and nominated him Inspector General of Cavalry. This post admirably suited Grouchy, who was a horseman by nature and a cavalry soldier by instinct. Later, on the formation of the Army of the Ocean, he was appointed to the command of an infantry division in Marmont's corps in Holland, and it was with Marmont that he made the campaign of 1805. In October 1806, he was summoned from Italy to a more important command. The Grand Army was advancing on Prussia, and Napoleon had need of capable leaders to command his vast masses of cavalry. Grouchy was entrusted with the 2nd Division of Dragoons of the Cavalry Corps under Murat, and played a prominent part in the Battle of Prinsloo and the pursuit to Lübeck. At Eylau, he had a narrow escape. His charger was killed in the middle of the melee, and he was only saved by the devotion of his aide-de-camp. Though much shaken, he was able to resume command of his division, and distinguished himself by his fierce charges in the blinding snow. At Friedland, a chance occurred for which his capacity proved fully equal. Murat was absent at Königsberg trying to get across the enemy's rear, and Grouchy was in command of all the reserve cavalry at the moment the advance guard interrupted the Russian retreat. It was his admirable handling of the cavalry under Lannes's directions which held the Russians in check for 16 hours, until Napoleon was able to concentrate his divisions and give the Russians the coup de grace. The emperor showed his gratitude by presenting the general with the Grand Cross of Baden, investing him with the Cordon of the Legion of Honor, and granting him the domain of Noailles in the department of Posen. The following year, 1808, saw Grouchy, now a count of the empire, with Murat in Spain, acting as governor of Madrid. But when, in the autumn, Joseph evacuated all the western provinces, Grouchy, whose health had been much shaken by the Polish campaign, was granted leave of absence and took care not to be sent back, for he had seen enough of the Spanish to foresee the terrible difficulties of guerrilla warfare. Moreover, the annexation of the country was contrary to his ideas of political justice. When the war with Austria was imminent, Napoleon sent him to Italy to command the cavalry of the viceroy's army. With Prince Eugene, he fought through Styria and Carinthia, and distinguished himself greatly at the Battle of Raab. At Wagram, his cavalry was attached to Davout's corps, and his fierce charges, which helped to break the Austrian left, brought him again under the notice of the emperor, who showed his appreciation by appointing him Colonel General of Chasseurs. In 1812, the Count was summoned once again to the field, to command the 3rd Corps of Reserve Cavalry with the Grand Army in Russia. At Moscow, his cuirassiers, saber in hand, drove the Russians out of the great redoubt, but Grouchy himself was seriously wounded. During the retreat from Moscow, he commanded one of the sacred bands of officers who personally guarded the emperor, but his health, never good, completely broke down under the strain, and he was allowed to return straight home from Vilna. A year elapsed before he had sufficiently recovered to take the field, and it was not till the beginning of 1814 that he was fit for service. During the campaign in France, first under Victor and later with Marmont, he commanded the remnant of the reserve cavalry, but on March 7th at Craonne, he was once again so badly wounded that he had to throw up his command. During the Restoration, Grouchy remained at his home. His relations with the Bourbons were not cordial, and he bitterly resented the loss of his title of Colonel General of Chasseurs. Accordingly, when Napoleon returned from Elba and France, seemed to welcome him with open arms. In spite of having accepted the Cross of St. Louis, he had no scruple in answering the emperor's summons. He was entrusted with the operations against the Duc d'Angoulême round Lyons, but disliked the task, for he remembered the fate of the Duc d'Enghien. And in spite of Napoleon's protests that he only desired to capture the Duke in order to make the Austrians send back the Empress, Grouchy determined that, if possible, while doing everything to defeat the Royalists, he would not capture d'Angoulême. Unfortunately, the Duke refused the opportunity to escape which was offered him, and Grouchy had to make him a prisoner. However, Napoleon, anxious to stand well with the powers of Europe, at once ordered him to be set free. At the same time, he sent Grouchy to command the Army of the Alps, giving him his marshal's baton. The new marshal was delighted with his promotion. He had now served for 20 years as general of division, and although only 49, had practically given up all hope of promotion. But scarcely had he reached his new command when he was recalled to Paris. With Murat in disgrace and Bessières dead, the emperor had no great cavalry leader on whom he could rely, and, remembering the new marshal's exploits at Friedland and Wagram and his staunchness in 1814, he determined to entrust him with the command of the reserve cavalry. Unfortunately for Napoleon and Grouchy, the exigencies of the campaign forced the emperor to divide his army. So, while entrusting Ney with a part of his troops, with orders to pursue the English, and keeping the guard and reserves under his immediate control, he gave Grouchy the command of 2 corps of infantry and 1 of cavalry, in all some 33,000 men. The appointment was an unfortunate one, for the marshal, though in many respects a good cavalry leader, had never before had the command of a large body of mixed troops, and even his cavalry successes had been obtained when under the orders of a superior. At Friedland he was under Lannes, at Wagram under Davout, at Moscow under Eugene, and in 1814 under either Victor or Marmont. But what was most unfortunate about the selection was that Grouchy had not enough personal authority to enforce his orders on his corps commanders, and the fiery Vandamme not only despised but hated him because he had received the baton which he hoped was to have been his, while Girard was a personal enemy. At Ligny, where Napoleon himself supervised the attack, all went well, but from the moment fighting ceased, difficulties began. Immediately after the battle, the emperor entrusted the marshal with the pursuit of the Prussians, but Pajol, who commanded his light cavalry, carried out his reconnaissance in a perfunctory manner and reported that the Prussians had retreated towards Namur. Grouchy received this news at 4 a.m. on June 17th, but he did not dare to disturb the emperor's rest, and it was 8 a.m. before he could see him and demand detailed orders. Napoleon, trusting to Pajol's report, thought that the Prussians were absolutely demoralized and were leaving the theater of war, and so he kept the marshal talking about Paris and politics till 11 a.m. Consequently, it was 11:30 before he received exact orders, penned by Bertrand, which told him to proceed to Gembloux, keeping his forces concentrated, to reconnoiter the different roads leading to Namur and Maestricht, and to inform the emperor of the Prussians' intentions, adding, "It is important to know what Blücher and Wellington mean to do, and whether they prefer to unite their armies in order to cover Brussels and Liège by trying their fortunes in another battle." Bad staff directions and heavy rains retarded the advance, and it took 6 hours for the troops to cover the 9 miles to Gembloux, where at 8 in the evening, Grouchy heard that part of the Prussians had fallen back on Wavre, which meant that they might still unite with the English to cover Brussels. He at once reported this to the emperor, adding that Blücher had retired on Liège and the artillery on Namur. But, in spite of the fact that on the evening of the 17th, Napoleon knew that this was a mistake and that the Prussians were actually massed round Wavre, it was not till 10 a.m. on the morning of Waterloo that he sent to the marshal informing him of the Prussians' concentration and telling him that he must therefore move thither, i.e., to Wavre, in order to approach us and to push before him any Prussians who may have stopped at Wavre. This was the exact course which Grouchy had determined to pursue. It is therefore quite clear that neither the emperor nor the marshal had dreamed that Blücher would attempt to give any assistance to the English in their position at Waterloo. At 11 a.m., when his columns were just approaching Wavre, the marshal heard the commencement of the cannonade at Waterloo. Girard entreated him to march to the sound of the cannon, but Grouchy had what he considered distinct orders to pursue the Prussians. He was now in touch with them, and with a force of 33,000 men, he did not dare to make a flank march in the face of what, he was becoming convinced, was the whole Prussian army. At 5 p.m., he received Napoleon's dispatch, hastily written at 1 p.m., ordering him to turn westward and crush the Prussian corps which was marching on the emperor's right rear. But by then, his main force was heavily engaged at Wavre, and even if he had been able to dispatch part of his force, it could not have arrived at Mont-Saint-Jean till long after the end of the battle. On the morning of the 19th, the marshal was preparing to pursue Thielmann's corps, which on the previous evening he had driven from Wavre, when he heard of the catastrophe at Waterloo. He immediately stopped the pursuit, and by rapid marching, reached Namur before the Allies could cut him off, and by a skillful retreat, brought back his 33,000 men to Paris before the enemy arrived at the gates. But instead of the thanks he had expected, he found himself saddled with the blame of the loss of Waterloo. The disaster, however, clearly rested on the emperor, whose orders were vague, and who had not realized the extraordinary moral courage of Blücher and the stubbornness of the Prussians. And if Napoleon did not foresee this, he could not blame Grouchy for being equally blind. The marshal did all that a mediocre man could do. He carefully carried out the orders given him, trusting, no doubt, too much to the letter, too little to the spirit. But long years spent in a subordinate position under a military hierarchy like that of the empire were bound to stifle all initiative. And it was not to be supposed that the man who, 20 years earlier, had failed to rise to the occasion in Ireland would, after at last gaining his marshal's baton, risk his reputation by marching, like Desaix at Marengo, to the sound of the guns, across the front of an enemy vastly superior to himself, through a difficult country partially waterlogged and intercepted by deep, broad streams, contrary to what seemed his definite orders. The marshal's career really ended on the abdication of the emperor, though he was appointed by the provisional government to the command of the remains of the Army of the North, and in this capacity proclaimed the emperor's son as Napoleon II. On gaining Paris, he found himself subordinate to Davout, an old enemy. Accordingly, he threw up his command and retired into private life. After his conduct during the 100 Days, he could expect no mercy from the returned Bourbons, and was glad to escape abroad. Included in the general pardon, he returned to France in 1818, but his marshalate was annulled, and he never regained his baton, though on the accession of Charles X, he was actually received at court. But though the king might forgive, his favorites and ministers could not forget, and in December 1824, he was included among the 50 generals of Napoleon who were placed on the retired list, an action which General Foy shrewdly remarked was a cannon shot charged at Waterloo, fired 10 years after the battle, and pointed direct at its mark. Like many another of the marshals, the veteran retained his health and faculties for many years and defended his character and actions and criticized his enemies with the same clear logic which had so powerfully contributed to his early advancement. For the ex-marshal wielded the pen as easily as the sword. It was not till 1847 that death carried off the sturdy old warrior at the age of 81.
This concludes Chapter 20 of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Join us also for Chapter 21 about Francois Kellerman. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. We'll get back to you next week. Thank you very much, and so long.